We both had. Yeah, we're really sorry.
We are on what's called the home stretch. So I encourage you to grab a snack, grab some water.
Ultimately, that's one of What?
And you will have me. I'll just say it's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to see folks that I haven't seen in a while. It's especially a pleasure to see Eddie that's I've known for a long time and owe a lot to. And thanks to him, the way that he and Ned have shaped me and been willing to spend time. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
So we're on the page. At the top says female elders. So the metaphor that I want for us to consider here is one perhaps that you might not have thought, but is one most real. A fly on the wall. Okay? So I've been to a number of churches where they've talked about the kinds of things that you're talking about. Okay? And in those congregations, it varies widely. Some churches do everything up to preaching and elders, and some churches do absolutely nothing. Most do something, and most do something except preaching and elders. So, what I'd like for you to do is to have an opportunity to overhear the discussions of the churches that decided, yeah, we're going to go ahead and do preaching and elders. What are the kinds of conversations they have? Okay? What are the kinds of things that were important to them as they thought through this? It's not necessarily be the ones that will be important to you, but I think it might be helpful for you to overhear those conversations. So as I decided what to choose to include, I included the things that I've heard most often in those conversations. And you may have some other questions, we'll have an opportunity for that, but these are the ones that I've heard most often, and you can overhear what those conversations sound like. So, in the congregations that I've been a part of, it's been important for them to have a theology of gender, to come to some kind of understanding what they think about male and female under God. And the passages that have been very determinative for them are the ones that we've spent some time with recently. The creation passage. If we want to understand how males and females are, let's go back to the very beginning moment when they're created, right? And so that passage that we just talked about there from Genesis has been very formative for them. And for them, it's really important to try and get a sense of what's going on in Genesis with male and female so they can feel good about moving in the direction that they're choosing. So the same identity function kind of moves that we made in the theology are the same kind of ones that will be significant for them as well. So that's probably not too surprising. The second one is probably one that I see more often because usually the conversation gets framed in terms of not all three of those, God's activity, Christ's activity, and the Spirit's activity, but most often in terms of Spirit's activity. The church has men and women, they've been gifted with gifts, what do we do with that? Okay? And so the Spirit's activity is very close to the actual actions, right? Gifts, what are we going to do? Oh, we have Spirit-given gifts, let's take a look at that. And so that's the one that usually is at the forefront of the God, Christ, Holy Spirit kind of moves. And the passages that we talked about, Acts 2, Joel, Romans 10 is the move that Paul uses when Paul quotes the Joel passage. It includes Jew and Gentile. Okay? So Luke has age and gender, male, female, young and old, slave. And then Paul uses that same Joel passage in Romans 10 to do the male and female. And then the Jew and Gentile also comes out in the Galatians passage. But if you wanted to know where Paul gets it, he gets it from that same Joel passage, which is interesting. And so that's important to figure out how the Spirit is working in gifting the church. And in connection with that, what is the purpose? And so I like the 1 Corinthians 12 passage because it talks about a multitude of gifts, and lists a bunch of them, right? But it talks about them in terms of the purpose of the common good. Okay? And I think that's been very helpful to folks. If the Spirit gives everyone, how are we going to use them? Yes, we're looking for the common good. Another way of phrasing it might be for edification that we saw in 1 Corinthians 14 passage. Right? And those questions that I've alluded to before, is there any indication in the text that the Spirit's gifts are limited or distributed by gender? And there's not. There's not boy gifts and girl gifts, right? This one's kind of interesting. The second bullet under number 3. Do we have women who already serve as elders, but we don't call them elders? Do we have women in our congregations that provide wisdom, pastoral care, model gifts of the Spirit? And for these congregations, the answer is yes. And in some ways, they have found it the most ironic that the last thing they did was something that women were already doing. Just hadn't been named so in that capacity, right? The same kind of thing on a more mundane level is the passing of communion plates. Women in every church pass communion plates. They just pass it side to side versus front to back. Right. So is there something theological about side to side versus front to back? Probably not. And we just haven't thought about that. No, they're actually already doing it, right? But this is a case where if you want to know what it would look like, there's probably some examples that you can see in your congregation of women who are outstanding examples of gifts of the Spirit, women who have gifts of the Spirit that they use for the common good of the congregation, women who exercise pastoral care. The third one is, so is it the case that, I'll express it in terms of myself, is it the case that every single woman I have met is less in terms of fruit of the Spirit? In other words, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, so forth, than I am? The answer is obviously no. Okay, so that experience makes me think, okay, if there are some other individuals that I know, some male, some female, who excel in patience, love, kindness, self-control, how am I going to be a leader to them if they're actually better than I am at it? And if there are folks who excel in those areas, shouldn't we recognize that they have those gifts and give them greater opportunities to use those gifts? And I expect that it's everyone's experience that gifts are not distributed by gender in terms of the fruit of the Spirit as well. And then, okay, is it appropriate for women to lead? And you just find multiple examples of women leaders in Scripture. You have prophets, you have judges. Deborah's also a prophet as well. You have women who offer advice to cities and rulers as sages. You have builders of cities. You have Queen Esther. You have teachers, deacons, co-workers, and laborers. I mean, there are lots of places where women are exercising leadership, and men are even told to be subject to them. The last one with co-workers and laborers, if they're working in that capacity in the church. So probably one of the biggest questions is the second page. What do you do with this phrase, husband of one wife? So let's spend a little bit of time with that. It's a phrase that occurs in 1 Timothy 3:2 in the context of a description of the qualities of the individual that we would like to be a bishop, overseer, elder. And in chapter 3, in verse 2, it says, now, bishop must be above reproach, husband, one wife, temperate, sensible, dignified, hospitable, and apt teacher. But it's that phrase, husband of one wife, that sounds like what? Sounds like bad. So if we're talking about elders and Scripture says that, then what are we going to do with that? So, turn over to 1 Timothy, chapter 5 and verse 9. And there we have the sentence, let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband. So we have the flip side of husband of one wife of one husband. So what I'm going to say is, let's see if we can figure out what wife of one husband means, and that might help provide us some leverage on our original question without having a lot of messiness involved. Okay? Because we don't have a whole lot of stake with this widow, right? We're not enrolling widows and stuff like that. Okay? So, one of the most helpful things that I was given in my studies at ACU is to ask of a text, what question is it answering? Okay? Ian Farrell was very good at that. And that saves me from some of those true but wrong kind of things, right? Because I'm trying to figure out what's true in this text, not just what's true in general. So, to give you another example, so if we look at Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and we ask, okay, well, Jesus was human. Does that mean Jesus sinned? Or does that mean since Jesus didn't sin, that he wasn't really human? Which one is it? Based on Romans 3:23, all have sinned, all men have sinned, fall short of the glory. Well, it's neither, because it's not asking a question about Christology, it's asking an anthropology question, right? And if you ask a question that the text isn't answering, you get some bad answers, right? So it's important to try and figure out what question the text is answering, okay? So, what question is this text answering when it says a widow needs to be the wife of one husband? So, I want to start with the negatives first. The question is not, is this person currently married? We know that, okay? She's a widow. Okay, so that's easy for us to answer. It's not answering the question, does this person have only one husband? We know that for two reasons. One, she's a widow and she's not married. But two, we don't know of polygamy with women having multiple husbands in the first century. There's a few examples of men with multiple wives, but there's not of women with multiple husbands. So no, that's not an option. Okay? Is this question, has this person only been married once? In other words, you can't remarry after the death of a spouse or a divorce. No, widows are in fact encouraged to remarry a few verses later. Okay? So those aren't the questions that are being answered. Although sometimes when we consider elders, those are the questions that we ask when we hear husband and one wife, right? Is he currently married? Has he only had one wife? Has he been married? So on and so forth, right? But for the woman of wife and one husband, that's not the case. So what is the question that's being answered with wife of one husband? And the answer is, was this widow a one-man woman? Was she sexually faithful? Okay? And as you look in the Greco-Roman world, this word in Latin, univera, often shows up on tombstones as a matter of character. This person was a sexually faithful person. This person was faithful to their marital vows. Right? And so, is this a person who is sexually faithful? So, if that's the case with the phrase wife of one husband, wouldn't that also be the case with husband and one wife? So, my proposal to you is, what question is husband of one wife answering? Is the question, is this husband a one-man woman, sexually faithful? I think so. There's a whole lot of evidence and a whole lot of discussion that Chris Hudson's compiled, same kind of conclusion, marital fidelity. So I don't think it's asking the question, is this potential elder currently married, had only one wife, ever been be married if they want to be married once, because those aren't the same kind of questions that that same phrase on the flip side is answering. Does that make sense? Okay. So, where does that leave us? It still leaves us with my number 3 there. Does this phrase presume that the elder is male? Yes, it does. We can exclude some things that it's not talking about, but it does presume that this widow is a female, wife of one husband. It does presume that this man is a husband, of one wife, is male. So what do we do with that? So some would say, well, then all elders should be male, because we have this example in Scripture, and it talks about husband and wife, and it presumes male. Others would say that the reason that the text describes the elders as men is because the culture at the time was predominantly patriarchal. That is, it would be surprising for folks at the time to think of leadership otherwise. And as we look in the culture at the time, other than Paul, there are really very few others at that time thinking in any ways that we might call egalitarian. We do have a Stoic named Sonnius Rufus, and his tractate number 3 is that women too should study philosophy. The idea being that philosophy makes one a moral person, creates virtue, women should also study philosophy too. And why aren't other people arguing for that? Why am I the only person doing that? Wouldn't this be for the good of our society if we had more virtuous women? And they'd become more virtuous if they study philosophy. So that's kind of a lone voice on the pagan side. So the expectation is, well, of course, it's described in male terms because that's the terms that they thought in. So the question is, what are we going to do with that? You're going to have to deal with the cultural aspect of the text that we mentioned in the first time, where I had a list of 15 things where male and female are mentioned, and we don't do them, like levirate marriage, men raising hands when they pray, so on and so forth. Is this one of those things, or is this something that's kind of inherent and we should only have male elders? So in my mind, we don't see, again, boy goes to the Spirit, girl goes to the Spirit. The kind of gifting that we're looking for with the Spirit doesn't seem like it's described in male-female terms, right? So when we look at the Holy Spirit passages, they aren't separated by gender. And so if I'm basing my actions on a theology of gender, how I see male and female understood in terms of God's activity, Christ's activity, and the Holy Spirit's activity, I don't see any differences there. And so for those churches that are moving in that direction, that's going to be important for them. Obviously, other churches don't move in that direction, and the fact that it says husband and one wife, and it's a male, is going to be kind of game over. The text says it, and we're going to need that, which I respect, going back to the text. At the same time, as you know from our interpretation of the text, there's often a number of factors that come into the interpretation of the text when it says something and are actually following it. So, going back to the front page that we have there. The other passage that ends up being a discussion point, but probably not a big discussion point, is the 1 Timothy 2 passage, the exercising authority. The word that's translated there, althantane, is really better translated as being bossy. And folks who are teaching or in leadership shouldn't be bossy. We have Jesus saying that to anyone. The Gentiles think they should lord it over you, but I say we should be servants, right? So that's not a male-female kind of thing. But in this context, in Ephesus, in 1 Timothy it was, and so Paul says, women not be bossy, in a very specific context, specific command kind of way. That one's usually a conversation point, but probably not as big as the elder husband and one wife one. And then there's the appeal to experience. We have experienced women exercising authority in many ways in contemporary culture. Does it make sense that women can be judges, leaders, mayors throughout the week, but they somehow can't lead on Sunday mornings with the skills that they have in leadership, godliness, don't somehow fall on Sunday morning? Those are questions that these churches ask. If one believes that men, by their very nature, should rule over women, then shouldn't one also oppose careers in voting where women have authority? If it is talking about the nature of what it means to be male and female, that men inherently lead as per their nature, then should we be behaving in ways that are consistent with that as Christians trying to live that out? And the fact that our experience tells us something totally different is a factor for these folks. Okay? And then the last one, culture. Scripture contains cultural expectations of gender that we no longer follow. We talked about those. Given the mutuality between male and female at creation and in Christ, does it make sense to understand male headship as a cultural expectation which does not apply to our context? And for folks who move in terms of female elders, they would say yes. They would also play a little bit probably with the 1 Corinthians 11 passage where the Christ is the head of man, man is the head of woman. Passage there where we talk about how are we going to understand head there. Does it mean authority over, or does it mean source? So that's probably also a discussion. Usually not as much as the other ones are in my experience. So in terms of kind of overhearing what those conversations look like, that's what I heard. There's probably 20 to 25 congregations that have female elders, and others that have said in principle, yes, but we're not there yet. So it's not nothing, but it's not 100 either. I would say that, yeah, it's hard to say. The last couple of years of COVID, I just haven't heard so much from what's going on with churches. I would say in the 5 years previous to that, there had been kind of a run, and it kind of tipped up. It kind of plateaued and kind of tipped up again. I don't know what that would mean kind of post-COVID. So if you had asked me post-COVID, I would have said, yeah, I see more churches moving in that direction. Okay, now I'll conclude with a little bit of reflections on my own congregation. So the congregation that I attend in Abilene is the Venture Lane Church of Christ. And when I came there in 1999, they were in year one of what was to become a 3-year study on what are we going to do with women's roles in the church. And at the end of that time, they decided pretty much everything but preaching and elders. And so we lived with that for quite a while, from say 2003 or something to 17 or something like that. So 10, 12 years. And then at that point, we had a couple of years where we kind of reconsidered the preaching and elders. And so now we've had preaching probably for 4 or 5 years and elders for 2. We had women nominated when we had an elder selection, and both the women who were nominated said, I don't feel like the congregation is at a place yet where we could do that. I would consider that, but I think we need to have some more conversation before I would do that. And then we had that conversation, and then we had another elder selection, I want to say 2-3 years ago. And those same 2 women who were nominated 5-6 years previously were nominated again, and they accepted. So we have 2 female elders in our congregation among the 6 or 7 that we have. So that is disclosive on my part, letting you know kind of my social location from which I speak. So, what kind of questions do you have?
We talk about leadership,
Mhm.
and leadership kind of has that kind of heavy sound
It does.
of being authority. If you take our organization, our polity of an eldership, one of the things we said to the men was, as individuals, you're not bosses. You're not leaders. It's the eldership as it functions that leads. And so one of my questions would be that if a woman is a part of that, does she suddenly carry all the marks of suddenly being this big leader? Or is she more just one of a body of folks who are called to shepherd and discern and make way? It doesn't seem to me like that she's suddenly become an admiral in a world of JGs.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you from our experience that mirrors what you said. We think in terms of elders, in terms of pastoral care. A lot of the kind of leadership decisions are marshaled out to folks that are appointed for those, with the budget or purchasing kinds of things. Missions committee. It's not to say that elders aren't involved in that, but a lot of times they commission folks to work on their behalf and come back to report and do this. But it's couched more in terms of pastoral care and service than in terms of boss kinds of metaphors, which I think is more consistent with what you're describing there.
I would say too, I've known a lot of elders in elders meetings who they would discuss, but they didn't know what they thought until they went home. And because, and this is not necessarily a negative thing, they had more brains at home than they had in the meeting. And when they took their brain home to their other brain and thought about it, they would be better the next meeting in that. And so there's a lot of joint eldering going on.
Yeah, and one of the other models that I've seen with churches is they appointed husbands and wives as kind of elders when they appoint the wives, they're appointing the husbands, and appoint the husbands, they're appointing the wives. They've been done as couples. A couple churches have done that. And sometimes they use different names too, so that it's didn't feel quite as disjunctive. So, for instance, I remember a church that was hiring a children's minister, and there was one elder that said, "I'm never going to hire a woman minister. I don't care who she is, how good she is. I'm not hiring a woman minister." Okay, what if we hire a children's director? Same job description. Yes, she's awesome. That's right. And so sometimes they change the name to like, shepherds or pastoral caregivers or something like that rather than elders. And it just feels less jarring because probably much like you, I've grown up in elders and deacons have kind of official office, kind of authoritative kind of connotations that say pastor, shepherd, servant leader doesn't have. So I've done some churches that have changed the name of it as well.
My question, and you may or may not be able to speak to it, is overall, how does the elder group, which has all been men, I mean, since I was born, accept and work with the women? Because, no offense, guys, but you're a guy. They're all men. We're all women. The others are women. It's a difference, and it's a situation where they really haven't had to work together. Maybe they do at their office. They obviously relate to their wife at home. But this is a different situation. That you heard?
I can only speak from my context and the church that I'm in. And it's worked well. That may depend on the individuals, right? So I can't say that will never happen or there will never be any problems. That would probably be inaccurate and naive on my part. But in the context that I've been in, they work together well. They recognize they have different strengths and gifts, and folks that are gifted in more areas work in those areas. Even men disagree sometimes, right? In elderships.
Really?
So it isn't necessarily a bad thing to have disagreement and different opinions. But I don't think that men are precluded from having disagreements just because they're male.
Well, some of it, at least in my mind, is going back to the innate prejudices that we all have because of how you were formed and
Sure.
shaped. And
Yeah.
I made the flip off crack with your guys. But you are. But you bring
We're neither
that
male nor female.
and the way you relate to women, and by the same token, women relate to
I think it's
men.
going to be a challenge for any individual. I mean, we all bring who we are, and other people bring who they are, and conflicts can arise even under the best of circumstances. Among husbands and wives, sometimes there's disagreements, right? And you love this person dearly, and you've known them for decades, and you've lived in the same household and raised children together, and still disagreements might arise, or different opinions might arise. So I don't think those are going to be eliminated. But in terms of how they've functioned in guiding and shepherding our church, that part has worked well. Good question.
I think how to word this. Well, when I think about discipleship, I want to ask a couple of questions. I want to ask, what about the gospel is at stake if I practice X, if I fail to practice X? In that process, I want to ask, let's just stop there and make it that simple. So I guess what I would ask is specific to this, just speaking about male and female elders serving together. What about the gospel? And when I say that, I think we know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the integrity of the written word. I'm not talking about the culture of the first century. I mean the intent and thrust of the good news. What about the gospel is at stake if I practice or fail to practice both having male and female elders together, certainly? So I pose that question.
I'll answer in the way that I think they would answer you and what I've heard. So for folks who have decided to do that, these stakes for them are living out what it means to be human under God, right? And as I'm living out what it means to be human under God, I'm modeling God's plan for the world. And can we give a vision for God's kingdom if we don't model the kinds of things that we see in Galatians 3? If we don't have a vision for race and those kinds of things, don't matter, class and it doesn't matter, gender doesn't matter. And specifically, just looking at the way that society has done gender, don't we have something to offer here as Christians about a vision for humanity and what it means to be male and female, and both are created in God's image and both are worthy of respect, versus the way that women are often treated in society? Does the church have something to offer here that's different, better, healthy? And for them, I think they feel convicted by that. that, we want to embody what we see as God's vision for humanity. And we think there's some really healthy things that our society could see. And we would like to be that salt, light, pick your kind of metaphor for them. So I think that part is important for them because it's connected, again, kind of their identity, who they see themselves as Christians. Maybe in a more confrontational way. We don't want to have culture have the final word on what it means. We would like to be able to speak into that. Often the church has been taillights rather than headlights. Society moves along and then the church says, well, we should integrate our churches too, right? Here we have an opportunity to be closer to headlights rather than taillights, and should we take that? In its more prophetic kind of moves. I think I'm speaking accurately in terms of what I've heard people say.
Well, if we see gender more as a fullness move on God's part rather than a limitation move on God's part, it would seem that if we embrace fullness in what God is exhibiting in creation, Genesis 1, 2, 3, as a fullness decision rather than a limitation decision, to go backwards in that philosophy, go backwards in that creative theology, that impetus for showing God's fullness in creation.
Mm-hmm.
We go backwards in that and provide limit to it. We're not fully seeing God. We're not fully experiencing God if we put those demands on what is created to exhibit fullness.
Yeah. I'm not sure this answers your question, but it may reflect what I've heard more often. The creation move isn't usually as strong as the gifting mood. And so if you asked, what are we missing out on? We're missing out on half the gifts of the church. And that kind of weighs on folks much more strongly than the creation argument kind of does. Or at least I've heard that more often. They may weigh equally.
It's the same math, that fullness and half as much. Yeah, I agree with both.
But it usually gets framed in terms of giftedness. That's what I hear much more often. God has gifted His church, and we're missing out on half the gifts of the church by doing it. So I'm not sure they would describe it in the language you use, so kind of gospel stakes. Although some might. But that's more often how I hear it talked about, as the stakes. Yeah.
It's a little less of a question, but when you talked about the giftedness argument, to me the creation argument is strong in the sense of living into the ideal of what God originally created, and yet we're following the pattern of the fall and the consequences. And the idea of new creation, and we were talking at one point about sort of this arc of where we're going.
Yeah.
To me, that concept is very compelling to me. Not saying more so than the giftedness argument, but that sense of where we are, and are we going to live into the consequences of the fall, or are we going to try to be a part of new creation that goes back to the original design?
Right, so He shall rule over you. If we continue to perpetrate that, then we're supporting the curse rather than the cross.
Yeah.
Is maybe another way of kind of going back to the creation and saying, what are the stakes? Okay, well, if that's what the fall looks like, why are we contributing to a fallen world rather than contributing to a cross-shaped world?
Yes.
I guess to feed off of what your response to Chad, when you think about giftedness, one of the concerns I've heard expressed is a lot of women feel discomfort in going to a man for pastoral care, which gets back to, what really is the purpose of an elder. And do you find any merit in a conversation that says, because of the need for women to talk to other women, that in and of itself is a plausible reason to have female elders?
Right. So there is likely women who have histories that are difficult because of their experiences with men, and it might be very difficult for them to talk about intimate details because of those past circumstances. And having a female would not only be helpful, it would also be more appropriate.
And not that a elder's wife couldn't, I guess, embody that same pastoral presence.
Sure.
The reality is there's more weight. Weight in the appropriate term of of having someone as an elder that is of a similar gender, which really wouldn't even cross my mind, right, as a male.
Right.
So I guess the sensitivities.
Right. If I'm the default mode, then it makes it harder for me to see what it's like from folks who aren't the default mode.
Right. And I guess I'd never considered that until somebody in our church here had brought that up, which I found fascinating. So,
one of the things that I didn't include, that I almost included, and the reason that I didn't include it is I have a hard time I have a hard time reading it without becoming emotional, as you might see. So when I talked about, butterflies in your stomach, lumping your throat, I'm the lumping your throat guy. And so the water is not just for hydration, it's to swallow that lump. And I'm almost done. So the one thing that I thought about bringing, but I didn't because I didn't know if I could read it because I didn't get choked up, is I had a young man ask me, so I have 2 young daughters. What were the stakes for you and your daughters?
let me know if you need another bottle.
I'll get there. So, I asked my daughters, can you tell me? And I was surprised. At the amount of pain that was there. Because I felt like Mom and Dad were pretty supportive. Even though we weren't there, we were a church that was kind of working toward that. And I think it's probably important for people to hear that. That there are stakes for the young women in the congregation, as well as the young men that grow up with that. Let's see, where are we here?
Don't worry about it.
We're good.
I don't know that I can read it, but if someone wants to read, okay.
Because he don't care about anything.
I asked both my daughters.
I have 4 sons, so.
I asked both my daughters, can I share this? So this is shared with permission.
So the title is Reflections on What It Was Like to Grow Up in a Congregation That Wasn't Gender Inclusive. So I think about this a lot, actually. It's one of the worst parts about being smart growing up. While it was never particularly vocalized, after years of seeing only men in certain roles, you don't have to be told something, you learn it instead. And not only do you learn, you internalize it, and it becomes part of your understanding of yourself. For example, feeling unqualified to pray. At that point, it's not humility towards God. It feels like humiliation, and it's hard. Anytime I'm asked to pray now, I have a disadvantage. see the theory of cumulative disadvantage for more on that. I never got to practice. My spiritual growth in many ways was stunted. And I'm starting from my teenage self, but also having to undo a lot of the implicit responses that are buried real deep in there. I was asked to lead the pre-prayer and prayer over communion this summer and had a full-blown panic attack. I wrote this prayer back in July, but I honestly didn't think I could get through it without crying. Parentheses, which, having just reread it, I cannot. I use a lot of weird coping mechanisms in church, especially in prayers. Because of this, I prefer to pray prayers that someone else has written, because that way I'm only partially putting myself out there, not allowing myself to be vulnerable enough to have the tiny shred of self-confidence that I've nurtured over the past few years, only to be crushed. And I really can't imagine how bad it would have been had we not had affirming parents. Was it worth staying, I guess, in a congregation that wasn't gender inclusive? Yes. Was it a load of garbage at times? Yes. Did that make me so resilient in the end? Absolutely. It does need to be said, I blame you and Mom 0%. Y'all combated it as best as anyone could. I'm very grateful to have had you all as parents. Feel free to help share my reply with the group. I'd rather more voices be heard in that dialogue. I'd have loved to hear something like that growing up to help normalize the experience. And I'm assuming this is from your other daughter. I can say that for myself, it was incredibly devastating when I was young. I knew my sister and I were as competent, if not more competent than the boys in our youth group, but they were the only ones allowed to pray, lead singing, pass out communion, etc. It helped that we had parents who empowered us and made sure we knew our worth, but for girls not getting that affirmation from home, it's no wonder so many of our generation have left the church. I also had bad vibes towards God for a while when I thought that if He didn't think I was good enough for Him, I'd look for a God who did accept and acknowledge my value. That's part of the reason I tried out being Buddhist, Hindu, and all of that other stuff in high school. I can go into more if you'd like, but that's the skinny version. You guys did what you could to affirm us, and for that we are so grateful. I still have some wounds that aren't quite healed yet, but I agree with my sister in that it's made us great allies to other women who have had similar experiences and fierce warriors for equality. I actually think I've grown up to be as liberal as I am because I didn't want to be like the conservative, Bible-thumping, women must be submissive people group I grew up around and resented. I knew they were wrong about the women's stuff, so I grew to believe they must be wrong about the other stuff they believe too.
So I would say I'm biased. But these are good girls. And they had parents who were actively going out in congregations and talking about it. And they had a congregation that was working toward it and had done everything except for elders and preaching until just a few years ago. And so I was actually kind of surprised at the amount of pain. And, you know, yeah, that kind of hurts. But I don't think that I could understand because of my social location. I wouldn't have predicted that. But I think that's good for me to hear. And I think those stakes are there, not just with my kids. I think have a lot of advantages, but with other kids as well. And I think there are stakes for the young men in the congregation too. So that one's made me less theological and more based on experience. So I share that with you. You can take it as a worst.
If that sore was to fester, who would you send your daughters to for counseling? For pastoral care, I should say. See, it's things like that that most women won't talk to us about.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that both Randy and Cynthia in our church would do a good job with that. They're probably closer. Both are really good. Probably Cynthia. Randy's great though too. They also had a strong relationship with Doug Foster, and so I think relationship matters. But I think there's also some things about being female that I just don't know. That, I mean, I go out to the parking lot and I don't ask 5 questions about my safety the way women do. Where did I park? What time of night is it? Is my key ready to get in there? I don't think about those kinds of things. There's a host of things that women think of that I don't. And that's the thing that I really don't have access to in a hard way. I mean, I can read about it and it's like, oh my gosh. But that's different than someone who's experienced it.
I think that's kind of what Debbie was saying a while ago. We're nervous.
Yeah. And I haven't had the same experiences. And that became very obvious as I read my daughters. So, thank you for your time. I appreciate your kind listening. It's a pleasure on my part to be here. And I give thanks for who you are and the leaders, and I pray for your wisdom and discernment. And shall I close this out with prayer? Or you? Okay.